Everyone, welcome to another episode of Cross Examination. I'm Ethan Cross, and today I am joined by a very special guest, Barry Lancet. And Barry, why don't you go ahead and tell everyone a bit about yourself and your books?
Right. I've written 4 books to date, starting with a book called Japantown, which was a debut book, mystery thriller, that drew a lot of attention, happily. And it opens with a murder in San Francisco, Japantown. And there's one clue that nobody can read. It's a Japanese kanji on a scrap of paper among a couple of bodies in a pool of blood in Japantown. And it's not as graphic as it sounds, but it's just this one clue that's there that the San Francisco police can't make heads or tails of. And because of that, they call the lieutenant calls in a friend of his who's a Japan expert, an American called Jim Brodie, who was born in Japan and grew up there because his father was there with the military, and his mother was there too. And so that's how the story starts. That's the first chapter. So I haven't given, there's no spoilers in that. And that launched the book, it launched the series, and it's still going. We're on 4 books now. The latest book in the series is The Spy Across the Table, which covers not only Japan. Well, I should add that Japantown started out in San Francisco, then it went to Tokyo and several other places in Japan, and then it went to several other places overseas, which you'll have to read the book to find out. And so basically I covered 2 countries, America and Japan. And then in the 4th book, The Spy Across the Table, that starts out in Washington, D.C., goes back to San Francisco, goes to Tokyo, and then South Korea, North Korea, or as close as North Korea as you can get, and then China. So I went from two countries to 4 countries, 5 countries actually. Something I promised myself I would never do after the 2nd book in the series, which was Tokyo Kill, and had three countries. Every time you add a country, it seems to add a measure of difficulty.
Oh yeah, totally
And
different culture and all that.
because of the way I like to cover and write about these things, and I'm in Asia, so I have access to a lot of this stuff. And I live in Japan at the moment, and I've been to.
Yeah, I think that's the great. I've read the first couple in books in your series, Japantown and Tokyo Kill, and I think that's the thing that for me that really sets your books apart is you can just tell in your writing that you've lived and breathed that world, that you know that world, and can you tell us a bit about where you started, how you became an American in Japan, and how all that happened?
Yeah, it's interesting the way that happened. I was still at school. I was at Berkeley. I went to school at UCLA, and then I transferred to Berkeley in Northern California. And I always had this itch to travel and to live overseas for a while. And then I decided somewhere along the line that I wanted to work in publishing as an editor. I'm not quite sure how that idea came about, but it came about. Initially I was pre-med. That was mostly parental pressure. It wasn't anything I wanted to do. And then, after my first 3 months in college, I said, I'm not going to be pre-med. And so I changed to psychology, and that was quite fascinating. But it's a very fluid field, shall we say, nothing sort of concrete that you can grab onto. And so from that, I was that for a while, and then I shifted over to literature. But I was up in Berkeley, and I decided I wanted to work in editing and publishing. But I also wanted to travel, and I wanted to live overseas, not just travel. I thought, well, why don't I combine the living overseas idea with the publishing idea and work in a publisher overseas? That idea sprang into my head one day, either too many cappuccinos or too much something else. And I targeted London as a possibility and Paris as a possibility, as where there might be really kind of interesting overseas publishers. And at the time, my roommate was studying Japanese, and I used to kid him endlessly about, why are you wasting your time studying Japanese as a language you can't use anywhere. You're writing all those complex characters, practicing them every day. You never. I was kind of mean, and no, I was just joking. I was just ribbing him. And he had a party one day, and he invited a bunch of his Japanese friends over. And then when they heard I was traveling, they said, "You ought to come to Japan." And I said, "Well," when they heard I was going to go overseas to Europe soon, and I ended up. And they said, "You should come to Japan." And I said, "Well, it's the other way." We were in California. I said, "It's not on the way to Europe." And the guy was so crestfallen. You know, his face just fell right in front of me. And I said, "Well, it's a kind of a joke. Well, yeah, maybe I'll stop on the way." And in the end, I thought, well, why not? And that's what I did. And when I got there, I found that Japan had its own little mini publishing industry going on in English as well. There were 3 pretty nice sized, medium-sized boutique publishers and about 4 or 5 very small publishers. So I added that to the list. And in the end, I ended up here at a major publisher in their international division.
And what kind of stuff were you were doing? Books by Japanese authors for the American audience, or you were, what kind of stuff were you doing as a Japanese publisher?
Yeah, that's interesting. Once I became aware of the publishers here and I went back to the States, I found their books in American bookstores all over the place. It's just nobody knew, because how often do you pay attention to what the publisher is? But I ended up doing a lot of books on Japanese. 90% of the books I did were on Japanese culture of one aspect or another, whether it was art or history or sociology, some high-end cooking books, which kind of fascinating considering how sophisticated it is, and just about everything else. But I also did some books on China. I did some books on American art and craft as well. And so there were 3 types of books. There were 3 types of books. There were translations that came to us. There were original books by an author who might be a Japanese or an American or a European. And then the 3rd type of book was a book that I would develop. I'd find a subject where I was basically an acquisitions editor, where you're looking around, you're saying, okay, this is a subject people would really be interested in. There's no book on it in English. And so you look around for an author and a photographer if necessary, and find an expert in the field and get them to, and commission them to write the book and work with them. So I did any number of books like that as well. So all
Very
those
cool.
sorts of things.
Well, now the 2 of us first met through the International Thriller Writers Organization, who, if for those of you who watched episode 1, also where I met Anthony Franz, and I remember a cool story of one time we were at Thriller Fest.
Oh, yeah, well, this was at Thriller Fest, right? Which is the big convention.
Yes, Thriller Fest, a big, I call it summer camp for writers, that happens out in July in New York every year, and won't be happening this year. And they're actually going to be doing a virtual Thriller Fest, and I understand you're going to be involved in that as well. Who's gonna, you and another author be involved with you in a panel?
Yes. Let's see. Dawn, a woman called Dawn Hughes, who writes a number of books and she does screenplays as well. She and I will be having a conversation on aspects of thriller writing. Yeah. Mm.
And that's thrillerfest.org. Is that correct?
Their website?
Yeah.
International. Thrillerfest.org is one of the sites, and then if you search also International Thriller Writers, their website will show up, and that has information about the organization.
But the little background of Thriller Fest, it always takes place at this place called the Grand Hyatt, which is directly over Grand Central Station. Mm-hmm. So one day we have gone down in between panels, and they've got a nice food court down there in Grand Central Station. And so we went down and had lunch, and we're walking back up, and you and I are talking, and there's something going, you've got some news, but you're kind of saying, oh, you're playing coy about it and all this. I could tell you're just busting at the seams to tell about it. So we're walking back up, and you kind of let it spill that at the time you had recently sold Japantown to JJ Abrams, who
That's right. Yeah.
I don't think we need to introduce to explain who JJ Abrams is. So that was a pretty big deal. And then it wasn't, I think it was immediately after that, we went to a panel and your agent was on the panel, and we're
Yeah,
sitting out in the audience, and you lean over to me and say, "Hey, by the way, don't tell anybody about that JJ Abrams thing. We're not supposed to talk about it yet."
That's right. I was told not to say anything.
And then go ahead and tell us what your agent does as soon as he gets up.
No, go ahead. You're telling the story.
So he gets up there, and I don't remember if it was during a question or how it came up, but he totally.
It was in this big room with 300-400 people there.
A huge ballroom, and he just totally throws it out there, and you kind of lean over to me and go, "I guess it's not a secret anymore."
Yeah, they JJ Abrams people jumped on the book before publication and wanted to do it, and they were talking about a TV show, and so not a movie, a TV show, because they wanted to really go into depth and cover all the detail and everything, right?
So how did they just you said they found it before publication? How did that come about?
That from Robert Gottlieb and Erica Silverman over at Trident Media, the agency. They deal with people in Hollywood, and they were dealing with a very nice fellow at ICM, and he sold it to them, and surprisingly, because they buy almost nothing, and they look at hundreds and hundreds of things and they buy almost nothing. But they took this, and when they took it, the people at ICM, right, International Creative Management, is one of the big agencies out in Hollywood. Apparently, he told me later that everybody there, and they're the pros, were so surprised his whole office filled up with, and it was an impromptu party, right? Because that kind of thing almost never happens. And so that's what happened. But I was told to keep it under my hat until publication of the book. And I thought, well, all right. And so I did, and I told you, and then the book hadn't been published. It was still, I think it was a month or two away. And then my agent let it out at that, but he's an agent. He supposedly knows what he's doing. And that's what happened. Yeah. So, and the status of it now, they wrote a pilot, and they wrote a pilot for it, and they were proceeding along quite nicely. And then I think he was already doing the Star Trek movies, or Star Trek franchise. And then he got offered, JJ Abrams, he's got a very tight, small organization of only about 40 people. And Hollywood people tell me that that's small for somebody of his stature, but he likes to keep it small and tight. And then he got the Star Wars franchise, right? And that pretty much did in everything else he had. Everything else he had on his plate got dropped. And then he got the Mission Impossible, either a little bit before that, a little bit after. I don't remember which anymore. And so it fell by the wayside. This TV show fell by the wayside for a little while, and then it was picked up by another agency and another movie group, and that was plugging along. And then they got bought out by somebody, and this is the Hollywood story, right? And since they got bought out, and once they bought out, new people came in, and they just had their own ideas and shifted directions. So that contract expires. So each time I get a new contract, and it gets renewed, and they pay me each time, and then it expires, and then they renew it. And then since they got bought out, they decided to drop it and go in a different direction. So now there's several people, again, my agents, as well as another couple people in Hollywood, are shopping it around. And the Japanese version of the book just came out rather late. There's been 10 or 11 foreign editions of Japantown. And then, so that's what happened. It's kind of a merry-go-round, and you just don't hold your breath, and it's kind of interesting, and you get to meet a lot of interesting people. There's a few people here in Japan reading it now, apparently, a few Japanese Hollywood people as well. So we'll see what happens, and now Netflix and Amazon Prime and all these things have popped up in the meantime. So there's a big market.
Oh yeah,
it's out it's out in the open and free again. So we shall see how long that lasts.
Yeah, I know in my experience with Hollywood, it's really a different world than the publishing industry.
Really.
For example, I had like the thing where you don't hear from them for a couple months, and then they, contact you on a Saturday night and need a proposal of something. It's just kind of a different world. They're just pushing little boulders just a little bit each day, and you never know which boulder is going to actually roll down the hill and pick up momentum.
Yeah, for any given project, there's a number of people involved. It's a collaborative effort. So it moves forward. Any project moves forward in fits and starts, right? Because they've got to, a lot of people have got to put their, give their okay and have their input along the way at each step. And so things move in fits and starts. And if you get somebody in there who really has a lot of clout or is very enthusiastic, then it gets pushed very quickly, and it'll pop up a couple more steps, and then it'll stall again. And that just seems to be the way it works out there. So it's what it is.
Yeah.
So, it's
a different
world to be patient,
Yeah, I actually, when I first started out, I wanted to do screenplays and things like that.
Oh, really? Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know that how long I would have lasted out there trying to, write through that kind of stuff. Because like you say, when you write a book, I mean, of course it goes through an editor and it goes through, layers and stuff, but for the most part, it's your vision. It's your,
That's right. Yeah.
And with a movie or things like that, even if you write the screenplay, it's still, they're going to change it. They're going to do things to it. The book. In fact, I was told, when they were discussing my book for a movie, or one of my books for a movie, that I might be able to visit the set, but depending on who the director was, that a lot of times the director doesn't even like that, because then they're worried that you're going to go out to dinner with the star and give him some, or whoever, give them some idea that it doesn't correlate with the vision that the director has.
Yeah.
So,
I think it really, everybody has their own little reasons. And so what can you say? I think I hear TV is much different, that the writer has more, a book writer, right? The person who wrote the novel has a lot more status on a TV set than does on a movie set. But then again, I think it depends, as you say, on the director. Some are very open about that. And I suspect the more confident ones are, and then the ones who are a little bit more tentative prefer not to, stir things up or let things be stirred up. So, it is what it is. And it's an interesting world, but, I have a couple of friends now who work in that world, and they tell stories, and they love the job, but I think it's so fluid. You don't know. Sometimes it's like trying to get a project through, like balancing on a flotation device in the middle of a pool of quicksand, right? So you're never on stable ground.
Yeah.
My point. And I think that's the thing. But that's it's no secret. It's been that way for a long time.
Yeah.